Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a very well-known women's rights movement leader. She lived from 1815 to 902, and she was an author, a lecturer, and the chief philosopher of many women's rights movements led in the United States during that time. She was a very smart, well-educated, and interesting woman. She was born in Johnstown, New York in 1815, and was also the daughter of two very well-known and very well-educated people in Johnstown. She was educated at the Johnstown Academy as well as the Emma Williards Troy Female Seminary. She learned a lot of legal terms about the Constitution and also earning rights from her father, who was a very well-known lawyer at that time in Johnstown. After finishing her education in 1840, she met and married an abolitionist named Henry Stanton. She then became an active member in the anti-slavery movement as well as the abolitionist movement because her husband was also fighting for both of those things, just like she was. The Stantons went on their honeymoon in London to attend the world's anti-slavery movement. It was there that she met a woman named Lucretia Mott, who was also fighting for women's rights in the United States. 8 years after they met, they started to do many articles together and write books and lecture together, and it was 8 years after they met that they held the first ever women's rights convention in New York. And this was called the Seneca Falls Convention. In 1851, Elizabeth Cady Stanton teamed up with Susan B. Anthony and wrote books and wrote articles and also did lectures educating people on the women's rights movements to get more people on board during this time. After all she did to fight for women's rights, Stanton died in 1902, 18 years before women were actually granted the right to vote. So this was a very long process, and many women had to fight very hard to end women's rights not being equal to men. It was after she died that more women became more vocal about women's rights and started coming up with teams of their own to really help women's rights during the Civil War. To keep from being overshadowed by the Civil War, they needed to keep fighting and needed to keep getting people on board to really educate people about why it was important for women to have the same rights as men. The Seneca Falls Convention that was held by Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the first women's rights convention and helped really start the women's suffrage movement to gear towards the 19th Amendment. Many suffrage groups were created during the Civil War so they would not get overshadowed by the Civil War. So the government had to pay attention to what the women were saying. And after many, many years of fighting, women were finally given the right to vote by the 19th Amendment on August 26, 1920. This was a very, very big day in all of the women's lives around the United States.